So a little while ago I moved back into the same room which I moved out of 5 years ago, which is the attic in my parents' house. In those 5 years I've lived in Amsterdam and a lot has changed since then. What hadn't changed, however, was my room here. It was exactly the same as how I left it. And something needed to change. I decided that I wanted a new and bigger desk. Not only that, I also wanted to move it to a different spot in my room, which meant rearranging every single piece of furniture in here, because moving one thing means moving everything. So anyway, I went to YouTube and started looking for different ways to make a desk. I found this video from Creating Tech, where he made a desk using an IKEA desktop combined with a motorized standing desk from Amazon. But that felt a little bit too easy, and besides I couldn't really find a nice wooden desktop from IKEA. Next I found this video from Greenlight Life, where he made a desk from scratch, but that seemed too time consuming and I don't even have half the tools he's using there. So then I thought, isn't there a middle way? Isn't there a way that's in between those two approaches? Of course there is! And that is buying a second-hand tabletop and legs to transform into a beautiful custom-made desk. So let's get to it! And so this is where we start. This is a beautiful worn-out tabletop which I found on the Dutch equivalent of Craigslist. It is 240 by 1 meter, which is like 20 by 8 Big Macs for all you Americans out there. It has got some dents and imperfections, but that adds to the character in my opinion. After doing some measurements in my room, I decided that the desk needed to be 2.33 meters wide, so I needed to cut off 7 centimeters. I discovered these metal bits on the bottom of the tabletop. I'm not sure what it's for, but my guess is that it keeps the wood from cracking any further. There were actually quite a lot of these twirly fucks in there. If you know what they're for, please let me know. After buttoning up some decency, I decided that it was time to sand whatever I felt like sanding. But my sanding paper started to collect a lot of gunk pretty fast. If you have any tips on how to avoid this, I'd like to hear them. Slowly, the tabletop started to look pretty clean, but I deliberately didn't sand it down all the way, to preserve that rustic look. 1 meter is a bit too deep for a desk, so I decided that I would make a cut that left me with 2 strips of wood. One of 75 centimeters deep to function as the top of my desk, and one of 25 centimeters that would function as the monitor stand. After an amount of time what felt like forever, I could stand behind the top. It took me like 2.5, 3 hours, not counting breaks. The next day it was time to complete the monitor stand. I wanted it to be 1.60 meters wide, so that it would not only fit my monitor, but my speakers as well. After sawing, I discovered this long crack along the grain of the wood. I decided to give it a quick fix. You won't ever really see the bottom of the tabletop, or that of the monitor stand here, but I still wanted to sand it down a bit as it was very rough. You can see where the base of the tabletop was attached to it. Now, the only thing left to sand were the edges. While sanding the bottom, I discovered a lot more of these twiggly twoodlies. With the monitor stand sanded down, it was time to move on to the next step. So I moved everything inside to start the staining process, because it's raining outside. But also there's something I'd like to do first. When I bought this tabletop, it was still attached to a base. The legs were kept in place by a mechanism that utilized these 4 giant bolts. I thought they looked sick, so I was looking for a way to incorporate them into the design, and I think I found a way. It will function as legs for the monitor stand. For that, I drilled some holes in the wood and tightened the bolts in using a wrench. But first they needed to be taken out again, so I could start the staining process. Just like in my previous projects, I used this eco-friendly black stain for my tabletop, soon to be desktop and monitor stand. I wanted for the grain of the wood to be more visible, so I decided to give it a rough sanding after the stain had dried. Not only did this make the grain more visible, it also revealed bits of the whitewash look that was underneath the stain, adding an extra dimension to it. I wasn't sure if I liked this at first, but I actually grew quite fond of it. Okay, so I completely forgot to shoot some good looking footage of these squared second-hand table legs that I found online. Being big and heavy, it adds to that robust and industrial look I was going for. The tabletop itself was already heavy, so turning it over turned out to be quite a challenge. At this point, I only needed to add a protective layer to the tabletop. For this I used a product from a brand called Osmo that is part natural oil and part wax. I thought of adding 2 layers, but found my patience running too thin, so I kept it at 1 layer. Okay, so adding this protective layer still wasn't the last thing that needed to be done. I had this LED light strip on my old desk, which I wanted to transfer to this new one. I added a strip of double-sided tape to the back because the adhesive of the light strip wasn't what it used to be. The controller and adapter I attached to the bottom of the desk, making sure that none of it would be easily visible. And of course I had to screw these giant bolts back in. And with that, the desk was complete. I'm really fond of this desk, and I don't think that I can ever go back to a smaller size. The darker tones give it a certain elegance, and the bulky legs with the rough surface of the desktop give it that rustic look I was aiming for. The bolts that I reused as legs also add to that feel. It's great to have my speakers and monitor on ear/eye level now. I left some space between the right side and the wall, so I'd have my bass guitars within reach. And last but not least, the desktop sits just above the radiator, which I could now use to stow away all the cables. This desk cost me about €175 to make, which is roughly the same amount in US dollars, and a considerable amount of time of course. But with that I now have a fully custom-made desk with the exact dimensions, colors and perks that I wanted. I hope that I've inspired you to follow a similar sustainable approach, or in the least brought you some form of entertainment by watching this video. If you like similar content to this, please consider subscribing, and I hope to see you in the next video. Okay, bye!